always record something that doesn't suck. To start recording at like 7 a.m. so we're a little less cynical.
Funny is usually harder.
Funny's way harder. Video works, audio works.
It's $3,500 chair.
Woo!
Hello, and you are listening to the Think Big and Code Small podcast. My name is Dan Horton, and I am joined with my friend and co-host, Chris Westerhold. This episode is sponsored by Codecrafters.
This week, Chris had a chance to talk with Ashley from Aptible. The conversation focused on platform engineering and why it plays such a crucial role in addressing the challenges of scaling up and managing your infrastructure, the role of developer experience, and how essential it is to ensuring a seamless and efficient developer experience within your org, the importance of standardization, and the challenges of choosing the right infrastructure for your platform engineering. They discuss vendor lock-in and the need for a balanced approach when you're choosing your platform engineering options, and the importance of understanding the impact of those technical decisions on both the business and the technical teams. Lastly, they touch on building trust and the collaboration that is required inside of the project when you're doing platform development.
It's going to be a good show. Let's get on it.
So thanks for joining us, Ashley. I really appreciate it. You are the Vice President of Engineering at Aptible, and I really appreciate you taking some time chatting with us today.
Yeah, of course. I'm really excited to sit and chat.
So I guess, kind of tell me a little bit about kind of Aptible and kind of what do you do there? And kind of how did you end up in that kind of space?
Yeah. So I guess to start off, Aptible is a platform as a service. So there's a lot of other popular platforms out there today, like Fly, Heroku, Render, but Aptible sits at this weird intersection where we started off with a healthcare specific platform and have evolved over the years since then to kind of being a full service one, but it's pushed us to evolve to a point where we're a platform targeted more at startups that are growing and scaling up. So the way I like to frame it is like you start off with no complexity because all you have is your stupid little app that you're trying to get out there and get traction with. And then you pile things onto your app as you get increasingly grow and you reach a state of accidental complexity where you've just piled things on mindlessly as quickly as you can. Mm-hmm. And then eventually you grow to a point where you're huge, you have thousands and thousands of companies, and you have intentional complexity. And where I think we really strive best is that place of accidental complexity and helping people who realize that things have gotten out of hand, that they have growing teams, growing security and compliance requirements. They actually need a platform and helping them tame all of that. So it's kind of an exciting and interesting place to be in. How I ended up here.
Well, but before you jump to there, that scale up problem, I think is always really interesting because, you're in that startup, you've kind of built something and then you're starting to grow and you don't have the time, the energy, or possibly even the resources to help drive some of that architectural decisions and everything else. And I think that is a huge challenge that a lot of people struggle with because there's no time to be able to kind of do it.
Yeah. And I've seen, you see that play out in a lot of different ways. In some of the ways that it's not necessarily that you don't have time, but you don't have time to do it right, or you don't have time to do it consistently. For example, I talked to somebody recently who they were like, well, we have our staging environment and we have our development environment and we have production environment, and 3 different people implemented each. And so they're all done slightly differently. They all deploy onto ECS, but one of them goes through GitHub Action, and one of them you have to run CloudFormation, and one of them it's all just manually following steps in a document somewhere. And so for each of that, even the same outcomes, you're seeing different like different approaches, and the toll that something like that takes, even though they already have everything implemented, is still pretty high. And so it's one thing to just say it's a lot just to implement each of those 3 different steps, but then to need to go through them differently every single time is pretty painful.
Well, and you know, my head jumps right to testing. It's like, oh, your environments all have a different process, so your testing must be an absolute nightmare.
I've often wondered about that because I've seen a couple different solutions out there, like Release Hub, for example. They started kind of as a testing as a service, and what it means to have your testing environment not to actually look like your production environment, and whether or not that's as effective. I've been very, very lucky to be in organizations that have had testing environments that largely mirror production, sometimes to very scary extents where we were like even using production data. And so like I've been lucky enough to be exposed to like very positive versions of that environment. But I've wondered kind of like, you know, if you're using SQLite locally, but Postgres in production, what breaks? Probably quite a bit. Yeah, that's pretty fascinating. And I know we're not really talking about testing and those kinds of things, but I actually see some people, they'll mirror their production environment down to staging like once a week or once every few days or something like that. And that's how they actually keep it that way. But I don't know. The costs of that are kind of out of control as far as I see it. But again, that's a whole kind of different problem. But so how did you kind of end up in the role you're in? Like, I'm always fascinated to hear people's stories. It's always kind of a twisted and winding kind of road. Yeah. So when I joined Aptible, I joined them for a combination of reasons. One was just the mission of the company, which is empowering engineers. From pretty much the moment I graduated from college, I was looking for ways that I could use technology to empower other people. So it was a very easy sell to say, hey, you're going to use technology to empower yourself. I'm on board with that. That sounds great. So it was a very easy sell from a mission standpoint, but also they were offering me a very interesting position, which was support. At that point of joining Aptible, I had done engineering for a number of years. And so the idea of helping other engineers and being able to see something different every single day and learn a lot of new things was pretty compelling. So I joined Aptible and I did that for a couple of years and eventually became the most knowledgeable person on the product by a combination of supporting engineers plus needing to do things that supported our product. And so I kind of worked my way up through engineering and then managing other engineers as the team grew. And now I am the VP of engineering. So it was kind of just a logical progression all the way from starting in support all the way up to helping with everything at this point. A little bit of everything. We're small enough that it is a little bit of everything. So
it sounds kind of like you were doing like DevX before DevX was cool in a lot of ways.
It might have been. It is. Yeah. It's like thinking back on it. We have had internally a lot of discussions about job titles and naming. We actually went with the customer reliability engineer naming, which is kind of a DevX based thing that we stole from Google just because I functionally like the idea of when we'll help you build your platform so well that, you know, we don't have a problem getting paged when you get paged and that kind of ethos to approach to it. So I think, I haven't really thought about it that way, but it does seem very DevX. Yes.
Yeah. I guess tell me, that's pretty interesting. So tell me a little bit more about that role. I think that's like, I hear, you know, in the kind of the DevX space and even in just kind of, you know, team kind of, you know, makeup and you'll hear a lot of people with like embedded roles and like, do you have SREs? Do you like, and it sounds like it's a little bit of a different variety, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about kind of what you think about that role and how it kind of embeds in teams and ways that you might be able to help.
Yeah. I think it's an interesting question because this is probably one of the most important and most powerful roles at Aptible. And one of the things that makes us most successful is just having engineers and people who really understand our product and what our customers are doing in a front of the line tier 1 support position. Like if you open a support request, if you try to reach us in Slack, you're going to be talking to an engineer. And I think that has really empowered us both to build a better product, because we fundamentally understand what our customers are doing to the point where we are at times equally annoyed by it. And it also has helped us build stronger relationships with people and help them kind of better understand their own product and like the influences that different choices make. And so, yeah, I think it's been like, it's a very, very strong tool for us bidirectionally, as a portion of our product.
Yeah. So in the end, you're really like, you basically have a platform engineering product. And I guess, a lot of people like, that's a really overused word along with a lot of things these days. And I can come up with probably 2 or 3 different answers to what does like platform engineering mean. But, when you think of kind of platform engineering, how do you actually think about it and the challenges that might come along with it?
So I think the easiest thing to start by saying is that I view platform as the infrastructure and the set of tools that help you run that infrastructure. And really the really important piece of it is the tools, because if you spin up your infrastructure once and then just let it sit and never do anything with it, because I don't know, you're running a static website, you don't need a platform. You really don't. Like, you just need to spin it up that once and move on with your life. But like the way that the place that the platform really excels is in those day-to-day interactions. So when I was talking to my team about doing this and like different things that they liked about the platform, one of the things that our team brought up is that I didn't even think of is we make it very easy to connect to databases that are internally hosted, so that data teams can use the database, like can run queries against the database without actually exposing the database to the internet. Something stupidly trivial, but like also when you're doing that in AWS, it's like 15 different things. And you might need to do it 5 different times or edit security groups every single time you add a new source or something. And so we made that trivial day-to-day interaction easier. And I think that's where the secret with platform engineering is whatever your day-to-day interactions are, making those easier. And then I think the other side of it is just achieving a baseline of stability and reliability, which is something like I forget about constantly because we do it so well. But that's a lot where this support role comes in, is when something goes wrong, also having that reassurance that, hey, somebody is here to back you up, whether it's Aptible's fault, which it usually isn't, but I guess once in a while, it's AWS's fault. I'll push it to them. Whether it's AWS's fault or it's something that your team is experiencing internally. We saw this a lot during COVID. Like I mentioned, we have a lot of healthcare customers. Yeah. And so customers that were going from like, I have 10 users a month to like, I need to figure out how to support 10 million users a month. Can you help me with this? And helping through those things. So yeah, it's the day-to-day interactions that I think really, really make the platform important. And like, what that is what that means to you.
Yeah, because I see tons of examples of that. And, I think databases, like even connecting to a database is a good example, but like creating a new one, how do I want something as basic as an S3 bucket or like any of those kinds of things. And, there's like, I always kind of joke, when everybody, somebody tells me it's like, oh, we don't really have a platform for this or for that. And I'll always go back to them and say, yeah, you do. You just didn't put it together deliberately. Your people have cobbled it together in one way or another, and whether it's through a assortment of tickets or whatever to get something done, like there's just this process they have to follow, and who knows what it might be.
Yeah. And like I said, it's like, if you're doing it once, that's great. And go ahead and just do it once. But most people aren't doing things once. Most people are doing things that evolve. And I think also like a big question about platform is if somebody wakes up tomorrow and says, I want to incorporate this new thing we weren't using before, how do you incorporate it? Where does it fit? Do you have a story for that? Probably not. But to your point, it could just be create a ticket and don't think about how it fits into the bigger picture or whether or not people will need it in a testing or development environment.
Yeah. I also like to think about it from an architectural fragmentation problem, or as an experience problem of, there's these things that we need to create, but then we also want to keep it we need a process to be able to do that. And what's a mechanism to make that happen? And a platform is, in its kind of loosest form, a good way of just driving, instead of there being many, many assorted tools around the world or around your organization, you can actually start to put it together into a cohesive thing that can be managed and worked through.
Yeah, and I think this is something that becomes more important as your team grows, just because a stupid small platform may work very well when you're a small company, but when you have 10 different teams who are all trying to do things a different way, what do? Do you bottleneck those teams by telling them, no, you can't deploy this new thing you just wrote until the platform team goes through it? Do you deploy everything as a scary monolith? What's your solution to ever trying something new, or does your team just not try anything new? I guess that's a valid choice, that your team just keeps the same architecture and infrastructure and operates within that.
I think that's an interesting a kind of dichotomy almost, because you've seen some of these older school companies that never change anything. They're using the same stuff they've used for the last 50 years. But then there's also other companies that seem to change, front end JavaScript libraries like it's candy. And where do you find the right balance? I think is always the interesting thing when it comes to some of that. Yeah,
I think that's an excellent question that I wish I knew the answer to, because as an engineering leader, I struggle with it myself. We tend to prefer older, more tried and true technologies when we do things, just because we do have such a high stability and reliability bar. But there is room for us to experiment and try new things. And I do like to try to do that. We have an eclectic mix of languages across our code base as a result of experimenting and trying new things. So I think for us, we've struck a balance, but I don't know what that balance would look like. And I do think it does differ from every organization, especially driven by what your security, reliability, employee retention needs, like hiring needs, look like. Yeah. And it's just such a varied question that I think it's hard to answer. That said, I don't think that, keeping the same technologies and keeping the same approach gets you away from a platform, because you see a lot of people migrating from on-prem to cloud, and now from cloud to on-prem is becoming cooler. And so even being able to do things like that, where you're experimenting with different approaches or with different cost-saving mechanisms, like how do you do that?
Well, and I think that is you hit on a huge, or at least what I see is a huge value proposition for a platform, because I think of a good platform as abstracting away complexities for your developers, and the underlying technology shouldn't really matter to the application teams themselves. So if you were to say that I'm on AWS, or I'm moving to GCP or Azure, or I'm going back to on-prem, it really, especially on an organization of any scale, you should be able to do that relatively easily.
I agree conceptually, but I have to ask, how do you feel then about different things? Like ECS is a pretty clear example of that gets you locked pretty hard into AWS. So how does that translate as you migrate? And are you just truly able to pretend that that's not happening? Or are you kind of pushing for Kubernetes or open source everything?
Well, I think you need to having a declarative way of describing your applications, I think, is the first step, because then you can say okay, well, I know what this should look like, and I know the pieces that need to make this happen. And if you start thinking about ephemeral environments and those kinds of things, it's another first step for that. But if you know what if you know what the application should look like and what the deployment should look like, you should then be able to not easily per se, but change the underlying infrastructure without having without being completely vendor locked, right? Like it's going to be a huge pain because like if you're moving from ECS to whatever other, thing that's out there, like there's going to be differences and challenges that come from that. But I guess I hate vendor lock. I'm like allergic to it in every way. And, a lot of the kind of hyperscalers of the world, that is their primary goal, is to get you as vendor locked as possible.
Yeah. I kind of figured that's the way you would lead, but I was curious just because I think the frustrating thing is that, and the reason I bring it up is because I do actually think that ECS may be a better product than Kubernetes, depending on your use case. Ooh, and so it is kind of, hot take. I guess I'm biased against I think that Kubernetes is like a beautiful, wonderful product that is way too complicated for a majority of use cases. And so I think ECS is also probably overcomplicated for a majority of use cases, but like less overcomplicated for fewer use cases than Kubernetes is. And so that's like, you kind of go up that scale. And I think there is some weird places where there's vendor lock in the middle. Like I haven't used Lightsail. That's what it's called. AWS is Lightsail. I haven't used it, but there's a place for it in the world. I see where that place is. Could you easily rip that out and replace it with, I don't know, like a DigitalOcean droplet and like DigitalOcean's pass? Probably. So yeah, I think it's always kind of interesting to just try to figure out where that fits. It'd be really cool to see somebody actually truly do something that was just like swappable from infrastructure provider to infrastructure provider without worrying too much about what's underneath though. So there's a business idea for you.
Yeah. Well, and some of that stuff, some of that stuff kind of exists already. I think that the challenge that I always have with all of those kinds of things is it comes down to scale, like you've brought up a couple of different times. And, do you have 150, 200 people in your organization? Then you're never going to go build this gigantic custom platform based off of Kubernetes and, have all of these different, it just doesn't make financial sense. But when you go into the smaller, like the more reasonable, most companies don't have 20,000 developers. And, but if you have a few hundred, there's so many better platforms than, you don't need the scale and complexity that a lot of those things bring.
Yeah, completely agree. And that's when I think about kind of the value that a platform, or specifically our platform, applies. It's the idea, and like what's so difficult about building a platform, I guess, on the other side, is the idea that like you don't actually need 500 ways to do something. It is super cool that the infrastructure providers offer you 500 ways to do things, but you don't need those. You probably need one, maybe two. And so the real problem of the platform is figuring out what those one or two ideas are and exposing them in a way that makes sense. And then potentially, if you ever, as you grow, maybe exposing a way to like break glass if you need option number 3 too. Yeah. But yeah, that's the real secret. And that's like actually the real difficulty of platform is like what 3 options make the most sense.
Yeah. And I think that is absolutely critical as far as I see it, because, if you you've got serverless, you've got Kubernetes, you've got, kind of your old school VMs, there's just seemingly never ending ways of being able to deploy something. And I've ran across many different kind of clients that you can see it. They've chosen every single one of these things. And then, then one of the next conversations they want to have is about resiliency and understanding what happens when things go wrong from a disaster perspective. And it's like, well, you have no standards. And if you have no standards, then you kind of get what you get when it comes to trying to fix things.
Yeah, and I think going back to kind of, again, hinting at Aptible's roots in healthcare, like security and compliance, I think SOC 2 is pretty ubiquitous these days. And so I kind of trying to figure out how trying to like pass a SOC 2 audit fits into 20 different ways to deploy and no consistency between them, potentially not even in like the mechanism for deployment. Do you see struggles there as well? Or am I like,
well, there's a ton of struggles there. And in a highly regulated world, you know, you just can't have some of that. You have to come up with ways that are auditable and traceable. And this thing happened and it goes through these mechanisms and that thing happened. You have to be able to walk your way through. But I mean, I guess that, you know, I'll kind of flip that question around. How do you consider, like, when you come up with things of SOC 2 and like, how do you know, with your roots in healthcare, how did you really start to solve some of those challenges on the Aptible side?
Yeah, so Aptible exists at a came into being at a pretty unique time, which is that like at that point in time, for example, RDS didn't even have an encrypted option. Yeah. And so there was a high, but not overly it was a high bar for individual companies to clear for themselves, especially smarter startups, but not necessarily a high bar for a single company to clear on behalf of other companies. And so there was a lot that we could do just in terms of offering encryption at rest and offering encryption in transit, automating renewal of SSL certificates that we could do. And so we have that strong basis. A lot of what we focus on right now is, again, as you move up market, is much more of that auditing perspective, figuring out who did what when, trying to integrate that into other security tooling, things like that. So, yeah, I think we came from a lucky spot, which is that we had to answer a lot of those questions early on that luckily like cloud providers are making pretty easy these days. Like I think it is not as easy as it should be. I'm going to be honest. It's not as easy as it should be to create an encrypted database or to know like with AWS exactly what KMS key do I use where. But it's easy. It's not hard. And they're getting there. Like I've noticed they changed their VPC creation screen to where it is like phenomenal. It is probably what I ever could have asked for and more, which is not something I ever say often about AWS. And I think they're iterating on it and getting the idea that their DX is bad and they need to fix it. But it's still harder than it needs to be. And so like we started off in a lucky spot where we made that easy from the beginning. And so a lot of the things that you need to do, just in terms of basics are easy. And then a lot of the things that you need to do on top in terms of like ensuring that you have logging enabled and protecting you from just going in and messing with your production applications and changing your code because that's the way you want to debug. Like we got that out of it. Like we have all of that handled. It's not even an option.
Yeah. I think that's one of the other really fascinating things about a platform is the fact that it forces levels of governance and compliance to things that in the wild, wild world don't necessarily tend to happen. And it's something that I think is a bit overlooked in a lot of ways because, you know, we've all been at companies where every year we got to go, you know, slide through these couple of things and take a little test and certify the fact that I know what I'm talking about when it comes to whatever. And that's all fine and dandy, but how do you actually in real time kind of stop dumb things from happening? And I think a platform really is a key towards making a lot of that happen.
And sometimes it's not even like stopping dumb things from happening. Absolutely. But sometimes it's not even a question of that. We had an issue recently where somebody had done something and it looked dumb on the surface when you were debugging it. But then as we went through the logs, which we conveniently had because our platform forces that, we actually found out that it wasn't that somebody had done something dumb, but it's like really insidious behavior of a third-party library. And so, yeah, there's like a lot of little things we're just forcing you to have continued access to your logs, forcing you to log all of the people who access this resource. Like those little things make it easier to piece together what actually happened and go through things. I can also pitch that this is kind of a bigger focus for us right now, is the idea of knowledge sharing and incident response, like as part of an incident response pattern, because the idea of like you're in a stressed out scenario and you need to figure out what happened, what's going on, what's impacted, and all of the questions that you can't answer in that specific scenario, in part because you're stressed out and in part because, you know, you're using 15 different resources spread across with all different logging and auditing mechanisms, or maybe some of them don't have logging and auditing mechanisms, and like trying to piece together what happened there. I think it's like, when you add in that level of stress, it makes everything 100 times more difficult.
And cognitive load is a real thing. And when you get under that stress, you will do some incredibly stupid things when you look back and you're like, how did I think that was the right thing to do? And it's because you're just under a massive amount of pressure. And, you know, when, especially in an incident where it's like, look, our whole company isn't operating or whatever, right? Or our whole product doesn't work. You can start to see some really bad things. And this is where, and you're kind of leaning into it, a good developer experience really starts to, you know, be a critical piece to that.
Yeah, I think that's when you are responding to an incident, you don't want what you're doing to get in the way. Like, you want your answers, your answers wherever you're at, and you want them to be very clear and very concise. And you absolutely don't want them to be wrong. And so there's that idea of like, if I'm in the command line debugging something and like looking up data, like that's where I want my answer. If I am in New Relic or Datadog looking at metrics, that's where I want my answer. And I just want it, I want it there, and I want it then, and I want it as quickly as possible. So yeah, there's a lot of, where do I meet the developer? What information do I give them? In what format? How quickly? That goes into figuring out how to support them through that experience. Like I said, this is a pretty favorite topic for us right now at Aptible.
No, I love it, because that kind of starts to lean into, like, you know, you're kind of on the platform side, but it kind of leans into the portal side, like developer portal side as well. What are your kind of thoughts on kind of developer portals and how they overlay with platforms and those kinds of things?
Yeah. So, transparently, I am a firm believer of platform and portal should and will be the same thing someday. And I think that's a lot of what we're starting to see and experiment with at Aptible, is the idea of, we noticed this pattern with our support team where we threw some metrics in the UI just to give people an idea of what was going on. And people will have their metrics also sent to like another destination, often the same thing as our APM or whatever. But when they open up a support request, like an urgent one, they'll send us screenshots or reference our metrics in the dashboard, because that's where they're going to debug first. Is they're going to their dashboard and then they're going to our support team and not really cutting through any other steps. And so we were like, well, what if we start putting more information there? And so we've been experimenting with telling you exactly what code release was deployed when. And we're starting to work on telling you like what your app dependencies are and whether or not like a downstream app or database is down. And this is like very portal like behavior that we're starting to embed in the past, just because we've noticed this behavior of people going to their platform to answer questions that like really a portal should be answering. And so I think that's kind of the beauty between like where the two synergize, is this idea of you've built up all of this information in one place. Why not keep stacking it there? Or your platform has all of this information that you may not have ever built up, because a lot of people aren't documenting their architecture diagrams. A lot of people don't even know necessarily where their logs are if they're using multiple logging providers, which is more common than I think I originally expected. Yeah. And so, yeah,
I scarily go to a lot of places that say, oh, well, we have Splunk, Datadog, and Dynatrace, and we have stuff that's in like, Grafana as well. And it's like, how exactly do you find what you need when you have literally all of the major players in the game?
I am a little guilty of this. We use multiple providers ourselves, and so whenever we're onboarding a new engineer, and I'm like, here's your credentials to 5 different systems, and they're like, what's in them? I'm like, you'll figure it out. Yeah, everybody else does.
I mean, that's when you think about the experience of things, and I don't think anybody ever sets out to go, I'm going to have one of everything. But there's a case that comes up. There's a thing that comes up. There's an acquisition or whatever, God knows what. And you just start to end up with all of these different things. And I think that's where a lot of people really struggle.
Yeah. And I think even again, to our best at Aptible, we do both support kind of trying new things, but also keeping things simple and old school. And even then we've ended up with these systems, not because we've necessarily chosen it, but because, we're using this thing because that's the only choice. And then this thing only connects into that thing. And so we have no choice but to use that thing. And we've ended up with a lot of divergence because of that. And so, yeah, I think some of it is just, there are no other practical options, and you're going to be doomed to doing that. And so the best thing you could do is make the fact that you're doomed clear.
Well, there's no such thing as perfect, right?
Yeah.
And, I say to people quite a bit, don't beat yourself up for where you are. It's never one, and you're kind of alluding to this, it's never one big decision. It's a combination of many little micro decisions that ended up where you are, to your point. Datadog didn't do this, so I needed Dynatrace because I had to solve this problem. Okay. It's a valid thing. Where I look at, kind of developer experience and even platform engineering is how do you constantly try to remove some of that garbage collection, essentially? It's let's maybe reconsider some of these because none of them are cheap. That's for sure.
Well, that's a question, though. Do you reconsider, or do you make it more easier and more accessible? I think that's a fair question to ask. Mm-hmm. And at what point do you balance the decision between the two? Because I do think, yes, standardization and simplicity is by far the best thing that everybody should do. But it's the classic problem of tech debt. At what point do you pay that price versus just making that price slightly easier to pay?
Yeah, I think that is a super classic question. I always go back to the metrics on this, which I think is always fun. It's okay, well, we have these 3 different observability tools trying to understand what happens when things go wrong, but then things are still going wrong. And what is the cost of being down? And it's if we have, 10 major outages a month, and I think I saw a thing that came from some kind of survey or something like that. But for the average enterprise, an outage costs them $10,000 a minute or something. I think it was a little less. It was $8,000 and some change, or a minute. And if you start to add all of that up, plus the operational costs and everything, you can get into the multiple millions of dollars every year very quickly on just outages. But I think a lot of people don't consider that in their calculus. And it's okay, well, is it easier to simplify? Does it make sense or does it make sense, to your point, try to just smooth it out through a better developer experience without really changing the underlying fundamentals?
And I think that's probably a really good reason to focus on having good SRE metrics and understanding the impact of your system. I do think it's pretty easy as an engineer to get lost in the technical choices and miss out on the business value or impact to the business. But I think it's really hard to make any of these decisions without an idea of what the impact of an outage is to your business, what the cost economics of your business are. Can you afford to continue running 15 different systems? Is your Lambda or your serverless functions getting increasingly expensive? Because it's what typically happens to them. And trying to balance all of that against it. And so, yeah, the business portion of this is a really, really big question that I think is pretty easy to overlook on like against the fun technical side.
Yeah. Yeah. So for people that are kind of thinking about starting their like platform journey or anything, they're, it's like, hey, I built my app and now everybody wants to use it. Like, how would you consider, like, what advice would you give to people on, when you're starting to think about kind of a platform journey, what advice would you give them?
I think the really important thing, and this is like the most common cliche advice, so I don't know that I'm adding much to the world, but it's like you really have to understand what you're doing and who you're serving. Because you can build really, really awesome platforms that don't actually accomplish anybody's goal. On the other side of it, you can invest an infinite amount of time in trying to figure out what to build and never build anything because you're trying to solve for too many use cases. And so that really, really intimate understanding of like my organization works in this way, and therefore I have to serve my organization in this way is probably the most critical foundational point. So what I said earlier, like I think the day-to-day interactions are really what serves it. And so when you start thinking about building a platform, you're going to think of like, oh, I'm going to build something on top of Kubernetes, when really the thing that you may need to start out with is like a CLI that makes accessing things within Kubernetes a little bit easier than using like kubectl directly. And so yeah, I think it's just like, it's really, really hyper focusing on what problems your team is experiencing and how they're experiencing them, and fixing the biggest blockers first. So it's like, I buy into the idea that platforms should be run as a product. It doesn't mean you need to be a product manager or you need a product manager, but it does mean that you need to actually be listening to your customers and understanding the problems they're facing. Yeah,
I think that product mindset is absolutely critical. Whatever role, like definition you want to give somebody, because I've seen, like the field of dreams, like just because you build it doesn't mean they will come kind of a thing. And I've also seen people in kind of the analysis paralysis, like you said, and that is a huge challenge. And unless you really do truly understand what they need, you're going to get it wrong. And, lots of people like to say that, developers don't like to talk. They're all introverted and they don't want to ever. I actually find that to be kind of wrong. Most of the time, if you actually can connect to them and like, look, I'm actually trying to make your life better. Like they'll tell you, they'll give you all the information in the world. You just have to ask them.
I don't like to talk, and I'm sitting here talking to you. I think that the secret is talking to them about something they care about, and you'll figure it out when you get there. Yeah. You will get them. I think there's like certain things that I would say about almost every developer I meet, and one of them is like a desire to complain. So yeah, I absolutely think that if your developers aren't talking to you, you're not talking to them about the right thing. I think that kind of hints on like another similar, less common piece of advice, still not uncommon, but which is it's really important to build up trust. If you're not doing that, I think people will try to find ways to work around you. And trust means something different in your organization. Trust could mean something as simple as delivering on time. Like you told them you're going to get something done and actually getting it done. Trust could mean that they trust you to deploy your product in a way that won't cause outages or break something. So it's kind of like whatever that means to you, it's really, really important to establish that so that people will come to your platform team or to you as a representative of your platform as an expert in what you're doing, and they'll collaborate with you and they will have these conversations with you because they trust you to figure out the right way to solve their problems. I think this is especially important because kind of like security, this is a thing where if you're doing it right, you're probably going to be in somebody's way. And so I think like it's the same thing with good security teams. Like the best security teams I've worked with, I've both felt like they were in my way, but I like trusted them to do the right thing, trusted them to collaborate with me, and kind of understood and empathized with the position they were put in. And if you can build that up with your customers, both, like I said, through delivering on time, through delivering a good product, then I think you're more likely to actually be able to build that collaborative relationship and build a better product.
Yeah, I agree. And I see this happen a lot when it comes to kind of platform teams in general. And in a lot of organizations now, it's like, it's free for all. Go do whatever you want. Go spin up whatever infrastructure you want. Go do governance. What? I don't need none of that. When you try to implement something like a platform to say, okay, well, if you want a new database, you now have to go here. And that can be hard enough. But if you move into managed services and say, hey, guess what? You're not deploying your application anymore. You're doing your CI, and then the platform team is doing the rest of the deployment and making sure that everything stands up straight. That is a whole different level of trust that you have to be able to say, yeah, okay, I'll give my destiny to you to make sure that this is working the way that you would expect.
Yeah, and I think it's hard for a lot of teams. I talked to somebody recently who they moved from a single managed service per team to a single managed service per company. And it was thousands of developers that were doing this. And they burned through a lot of that trust and a lot of the relationships and trying to get that up, even though they were doing the right thing. And so, yeah, I think it's a really impossible situation to be in, but I do think it can be handled. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see it way too often, and but I guess not as somebody who works on a platform.
Yeah, I think another challenge I see people struggle with is the desire to scale quickly. And I think that sounds like what you were talking about there, where it's, oh, well, this worked for one team. Now I'm going to roll it out to 1,000 teams or whatever. And you start to run into these edge cases of, oh, well, they're a little different here. They're a little different. This failed, that failed. And now all of a sudden you've turned your platform into this point of failure and not so much of an enabling team.
I think it's not just that, but it's you're viewed as a blocker, because there are also scenarios where it's just I know I could implement that in 5 minutes. And you're probably right. You could, but you don't have to implement it in a way that works for 1,000 other teams. You have to implement it in a way that works for your team. I have to go figure out what the 1,000 other teams are doing and then come back and implement this in a way that works for everybody. Or in some cases, hurt somebody's feelings by saying, there's just not a way we can do this. Mm-hmm. It's not practical. And I think that's a very, very frustrating experience. I think it's frustrating on both sides too, which is the most disappointing part. Is nobody wants to say no, but sometimes that's the most realistic thing to say. In part because you really standardization is very, very necessary.
Well, and I would generally state this a little more bluntly to their kind of bosses in that scenario, but you're going to hack this together in 5 minutes. I'm going to build a well-tested solution that works for the enterprise that is going to be reliant and moving forward in a way that drives not only the features that you're looking for, but the standards and everything else that people would expect to have.
Yeah, I think this gets into other things I feel about developers, but I do think there's a certain kind of developer who, and this is me, this is why I can say it, who is a very good enough person. They figure out what's good enough, they get it done, and a lot of things just kind of sit there are good enough. And then there's the good thing is, for me, there's the other kind of developer that exists in the world that then comes through and makes it perfect. And so I think it's very, very easy to be the good enough developer when you're on the side of the solution that feels blocked of but it's just one checkbox. Why can't you check it? I hear that a lot. And so I guess in those scenarios, I'm not the good enough developer. I'm because it doesn't work, because it's hard to explain, because it doesn't work the way you think it does, because it doesn't work the way somebody else thinks it does, because it's not compliant. There's a million reasons why you can't do something. Just check a checkbox.
It's true. And, there's a huge difference between autonomy and anarchy. And lots of people want autonomy, but what they really want is anarchy. It's I don't want any rules. I want to go do it.
I think, yeah, that's like the wonderful balance between people just want to go get things done and then are like very disappointed when there's no documentation or instructions or architecture diagrams or information about where the logs exist after they just went and got it done. I think there's like a lot of interesting solutions out there that are trying to solve that problem, but they're just like I'm thinking about the people who are starting to embed like infrastructure in code, and trying to talk about it that way. Like I think it's interesting, but I don't know that it necessarily solves the problem of people just wanting things to be done.
That's right. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me. Any kind of final thoughts or anything else you wanted to get out to the folks?
No, this is great. I love talking about developer experience and platforms and portals and the intersection between all of them. And I really don't love to talk, but I really do love to talk about this topic. So if somebody is extremely interested in the intersection between platforms and incident response, I'd love to chat.
Yeah, I would as well. And I'll leave your contact information down in the description. And if there's any follow-ups or questions or thoughts, we'd love to hear them. And love to have you back on sometime, Ashley. It was really, really great to chat with you.
Awesome. Yeah, I love chatting.
Awesome. Thank you.